My son-in-law told me I wasn't welcome in my own daughter's house the same afternoon I drove 4 hours through a February snowstorm to bring her soup. I had called ahead. I always called ahead. It was something I'd learned to do without being asked, the same way you learn to take your shoes off at certain doors or keep your voice down in certain rooms. I pulled into their driveway in Fredericton just after 2 in the afternoon with a container of homemade chicken and barley and a thermal bag on the passenger seat, the kind my wife Carol used to make every winter, and before I could even get to the front step, my son-in-law Marcus was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. "This isn't a good time," he said. My daughter Ellie was recovering from a C-section. She was 11 days postpartum and exhausted, and I had spoken to her on the phone that morning, and she had sounded small in a way that worried me. She had said, "Dad, I'd really love to see you." So I drove. "I'm not here to cause trouble," I told him. "I just want to see Ellie and the baby." He said Ellie was sleeping and the baby was on a schedule, and it wasn't a good time for visitors. I stood there in the cold for a moment holding that soup bag. Then I told him to let her know I'd stopped by, and I drove to a Tim Hortons on the edge of the city and sat in a booth for an hour and a half drinking bad coffee and trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with the feeling that was sitting in my chest. My name is Robert H. I'm 62 years old. I spent 34 years as a high school shop teacher in Moncton, New Brunswick, and I retired 3 years ago when the arthritis in my hands made it hard to demonstrate the equipment safely. I am not a dramatic person. I don't raise my voice. I don't hold grudges. Carol used to say I had the emotional temperature of a porch swing, which she meant as a compliment, and I took it as one. Carol passed 2.5 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. She was 60 years old, and she had just retired from nursing, and we had talked about doing a road trip to Prince Edward Island in the fall, renting a little cottage near Cavendish, walking on the beach every morning. We never got to do that. She died in October, which is a particularly cruel month to die in if you love autumn the way she did. Our daughter Ellie was 31 when Carol died. She had been with Marcus for 4 years at that point, and they got engaged 6 months after the funeral. I understood the timing and the way grief makes people want to hold on to things. I didn't say anything. I wanted to be happy for her, and most of the time I was. Marcus worked in commercial real estate in Fredericton. He was sharp and well-dressed and very certain of his own opinions, which I'd always put down to the confidence of a young man who hadn't had enough things go wrong yet. He wasn't unkind in the beginning. He shook my hand firmly and remembered details from previous conversations and asked follow-up questions, the kind of behavior that reads as thoughtful but can also just be a habit, the same way some salespeople remember your name. The problems started small the way they always do. After the wedding, I noticed that my calls to Ellie got shorter. Not cut off, just shorter. She was busy, she said. Marcus liked to have dinner at a specific time and she was trying to get organized. I understood that. I gave them space. I didn't drop by without calling. I didn't offer opinions on their choices. When they bought their house in Fredericton's North End, a newer semi-detached with a double garage and a yard that backed onto a greenbelt, I gave them $45,000. It was what was left of the savings Carol and I had put aside over 15 years, specifically for the kids. We had 2 children, Ellie and her younger brother Patrick, who lives in Calgary. Patrick got his half when he bought his place 2 years earlier. The money for Ellie had just been sitting there waiting. It was never a question of whether to give it. It was family money. It went to family. What I didn't understand at the time was what that money represented to Marcus. When Ellie got pregnant, I was careful. I asked before visiting. I brought things she'd asked for. I didn't hover. When the baby came, a boy they named Cooper, I waited 3 days before I drove to Fredericton because Marcus had made it clear they needed settling in time, and I respected that. The soup visit was the 4th time I'd tried to see them since Cooper was born, and it was the 2nd time I'd been turned away at the door. I drove home from that Tim Hortons in the dark, 4 hours through February, and I called Ellie from a rest stop outside Sussex. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she was awake and had been awake, which meant the sleeping story had been Marcus's idea. She sounded relieved to hear my voice and then immediately careful, the way people get careful when someone else in the room is listening. I didn't push. I just said I'd stopped by and I was sorry I missed her, and I hoped she was feeling better. She said she was. She said Marcus was very particular about the routine. She said she'd talk to him. She did talk to him. What came out of that conversation was an email I received 10 days later. It was polite in the way that things written by lawyers or people who think like lawyers are polite. It opened by saying Marcus and Ellie wanted to make sure everyone felt comfortable with the arrangements for family visits. It outlined visiting days, Friday evenings only, between 6 and 8:30. It said all visits needed to be confirmed by text no later than 48 hours in advance. It said I was not to bring food or items for Cooper without prior approval because they were following specific guidelines from their pediatrician. It said photographs of Cooper were not to be shared on social media without written consent. It said overnight visits were not being offered at this time. There was a line at the bottom that said I was welcome to reply if I had any concerns, but it was written in the tone of something that was not actually expecting a reply. Ellie had not written that email. I know my daughter's voice, and that was not it. I called her the next day and she said it was just to make sure everyone was on the same page. She said Marcus liked things organized. She said it wasn't personal. I told her it felt a little personal. She went quiet in the way she goes quiet when she agrees with you, but can't say so. I followed the rules. Friday evenings, confirmed by text, 6 to 8:30. I drove 4 hours each way, which meant leaving Moncton by 1 in the afternoon and getting home close to midnight. I did it for 2 months. I sat on their gray sectional and held Cooper and watched him blink at the ceiling light the way newborns do, still figuring out what the world is. And I told him quietly about the bird feeder in my backyard and the way the chickadees came every morning without fail, no matter what the weather was doing. He smelled the way all babies smell, like something new that the world hadn't gotten to yet. Then one Friday I arrived and Marcus told me at the door that Ellie was tired and Cooper had had a rough day and it wasn't the best evening. I had driven 4 hours. I stood on the porch for 6 minutes and then drove home. The next week, Marcus sent a text saying they were reevaluating the schedule and would be in touch. He was not in touch for 3 weeks. When the call finally came, it was from Marcus, not Ellie. He said he thought it would be helpful to meet for coffee and talk through some things. He chose a cafe in Fredericton, the kind of mid-range place that has leather chairs and a chalkboard menu, and when I arrived he was already seated with a flat white and the composed expression of a man who had rehearsed. He talked for a while about boundaries and Ellie's recovery and the demands of new parenthood. All of it was reasonable in the way that things said in a reasonable tone can still be completely unreasonable. Then he got to the point. He said that the driving distance made things complicated and that he'd been thinking about a way to make the arrangement more sustainable. He said he thought it would make sense for me to contribute to Cooper's expenses on a regular basis to offset the impact on their household of managing visits and, he said very carefully, of the additional stress that disruptions to routine can create for new parents. As to my coffee, he said it was just a support arrangement, something simple. He mentioned $600 a month, transferred directly to an account he controlled. I asked him if Ellie knew he was asking me this. He said they'd discussed it together. I asked if I could speak to her directly. He said she was home with Cooper. I said I needed some time to think about it. He nodded like a man who expected no other answer and probably already knew he wasn't going to get $600, but was establishing something else, some principle about access and leverage that was more important to him than the money. I drove home. It was a Tuesday in March, and it was already dark by the time I crossed back into Moncton, and I sat in my driveway for a while after I turned off the engine because I didn't want to go inside to the house that was too quiet. I thought about Cooper's face. I thought about the way Ellie had sounded on the phone from that rest stop in Sussex, careful and relieved in equal measure, like a person walking a line they hadn't agreed to walk. I thought about Carol. I thought about how she would have handled this. She was a nurse for 31 years, and she had very little patience for people who confused control with care. She would have known within the first year of the marriage exactly what Marcus was. She would have found a way to say it to Ellie that Ellie could actually hear. I missed her then in a way that was less like grief and more like a specific practical absence. The absence of someone who knew what to do. I did know one person who might. A colleague of mine from the high school, a man named Arthur who had retired a few years before me, had gone through a difficult divorce that involved a custody dispute with his adult stepchildren. He had mentioned a family lawyer based in Moncton, a woman named Christine Lebeau, who had an office on St. George Street. He said she was methodical and not theatrical, and that she had explained his options in plain language without making him feel like the situation was impossible. I had written her name down at the time on a notepad I kept in the kitchen drawer with the batteries and the takeout menus and the spare key to Patrick's place in Calgary. I found it that night. I called Christine Lebeau the next morning. She picked up herself, which surprised me. Her assistant had left early, she explained, without any apology in her voice. I liked that. I spent 40 minutes explaining everything I could, from the soup visit in February to the coffee meeting with Marcus 2 days earlier. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. H., I want you to do a few things before we talk again. Document every visit, every cancellation, every communication with dates. Save every text, every email. And I want you to have a conversation with your accountant about the $45,000. I asked why the accountant. She said that monetary gifts to family members can be treated differently under New Brunswick family law depending on how they were given, whether anything was documented at the time, and whether there is any evidence that the funds were redirected or used in a way that's inconsistent with how they were presented. She said she wanted to understand the full picture. I had done my taxes for 20 years with an accountant named Gerald Burke, who worked out of a small office in the north end of Moncton and who kept records the way a man who had grown up poor keeps records, carefully and permanently because he understood that paperwork was protection. I called Gerald that same afternoon. What Gerald found took a couple of weeks to pull together, and when I sat across from him in his office and he walked me through it, I had to ask him to go back twice, because I didn't quite believe what I was hearing the first time. The $45,000 I had given Ellie had been transferred into their joint account, which I had expected. What I had not expected was what happened next. Gerald had done something I hadn't asked him to do, but which turned out to matter a great deal. Because the transfer had been large enough to generate a paper trail, and because Marcus had listed me as a contributing party on some household documents at the time of the house purchase, Gerald had been able to request and receive through completely legitimate channels some financial records related to the transaction. What the record showed was that approximately $19,000 had been moved out of the joint account in a series of transfers over about a year and into a registered savings account that was in Marcus's name alone. The transfers were staggered in amounts under $5,000 each, which Gerald noted with the flat tone of a man who has seen this kind of thing before and is not surprised by it. The account had been opened 2 months after I gave them the money. I sat in Gerald's office and I looked at the window behind him where the snow was still coming down even though it was April, which is something that still happens in Moncton even when you think winter is done with you, and I thought about Ellie's voice on that rest stop call, the relief and the caution at the same time. I thought about how long she had been living inside whatever arrangements Marcus had made. I wondered how much of it she could see from inside. I decided she probably couldn't see most of it. That made it worse, not better. Christine and Gerald worked together over the following 5 weeks. I kept driving to Fredericton on Friday evenings, confirmed by text 6 to 8:30. I kept my face neutral. I held Cooper on the gray sectional, and I sang him the same low song I used to sing to Ellie when she was small, something my own father had sung that had no title and no real words, just a sound. And Cooper's eyes would go heavy, and I would feel him settle the way babies settle when they trust the person holding them, completely and without condition. On the 3rd Friday of May, Christine told me we had enough. She had drafted a formal letter documenting the $45,000 now reclassified, given the circumstances and the evidence of redirection, as a loan with full repayment requested. The letter cited the specific transfers, the dates, the amounts, and the account in Marcus's name. It also documented the pattern of restricted access and formally noted my rights under New Brunswick family law, which, like Ontario, does allow grandparents to apply to court for access to grandchildren when that access is being unreasonably withheld. The letter was precise. It was not angry. It was simply very clear. Gerald had prepared a clean financial summary, every transfer, every date, the staggered amounts, the account, and a timeline showing when it had been opened relative to when I had given the money. 2 documents, irrefutable on paper. I put them in a brown envelope. I texted Marcus on a Wednesday. I said I'd like to come Friday as usual, and that I also had some documents I needed to give him personally. He replied within an hour, which told me the Word documents had registered. He said Friday was fine. I drove to Fredericton that Friday with the envelope on the passenger seat. It was a warm evening for May, the kind that catches you off guard after a long winter, and the light was still up when I pulled onto their street. Marcus answered the door. He was dressed the way he always dressed on Fridays, like he'd come from work and made a small concession toward the weekend, shirt untucked but still pressed. He looked at the envelope under my arm, and something shifted in his expression. I said I had something for him. He opened it there in the doorway. I watched him read. His face did the thing that faces do when they're trying to process information that is worse than expected. The color didn't leave all at once. It left in stages, the way light leaves a room when the sun goes down gradually and then suddenly. Ellie appeared behind him at some point, the way she had probably been listening from the hallway because some part of her had known this was not a routine visit. She looked at the papers in his hands. She looked at me. I said quietly, I think the 2 of you need to sit down and read those carefully. Marcus started to say something. I don't know what it was going to be. He didn't finish it. Ellie took the papers from him. She read the first page. She read the second page. Her face went through several things. I know my daughter's face, the way I know the drive to Fredericton, every stretch and turn of it, and what I saw was not surprise exactly. It was the expression of someone who has suspected something for a long time and has just been given permission to believe it. She looked up at me. Dad, she said. It was barely a word. It was just my name. I know, I said. Marcus tried again. He said the account was for household savings. He said the transfers had been planned. He said it was a misunderstanding. Ellie let him talk. She stood very still, and she let him talk until he ran out of things to say, which didn't take as long as he probably would have liked. There is a particular quality to the silence after a person has been caught in something they can't explain, and I have seen it in 34 years of dealing with teenagers, and it looks the same on a 37-year-old man in a pressed shirt. I said I wasn't there to make a scene. I said I was there because Ellie deserved to know what had been happening, and because I deserved to see my grandson. Then I said I was going to sit in the kitchen and wait, and if they needed to talk privately, they were welcome to do that. And when they were ready, I'd like to hold Cooper. I went to the kitchen. I sat down at their table, the same table where Marcus had once explained to me his philosophy on interest rates and property appreciation, as though I had never owned anything. I made myself a glass of water from the tap. I looked out the window at the greenbelt behind the house, at the dark edge of the spruce trees, at the last of the May light sitting in the top branches, the way it does just before it's gone. 20 minutes later, Ellie came in alone. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. She sat across from me. She said she'd known something was wrong for a long time, but she hadn't been able to see it clearly. She said it had started before Cooper, before the wedding even. Small things, the kind of things you explain away one at a time until you look up and realize how many things you've explained away. She said the rules about my visits had been his idea, and that she had told herself it was just his personality and that it would get better. I told her it wasn't her fault for not seeing it. I told her it's very hard to see clearly from inside. She asked me if I was angry at her. I told her I had never been angry at her for a single moment. She reached across the table and took my hand, and we sat there for a while in the quiet kitchen, while somewhere in the house her son made the small sounds that babies make when they're on the edge of waking up. Christine LeBeau filed the formal notice the following week. There were several months of back and forth after that, conversations between lawyers, some of which I was part of and many of which I wasn't. And I'll leave those to Ellie because that's her story and not mine. What I can tell you is that Marcus moved out in September. Ellie stayed in the house with Cooper. A family law mediator helped work out an arrangement for the mortgage equity that accounted for the reclassified loan, and Marcus's lawyer did not contest the documentation because the documentation was complete. The $19,000 that could be proven was repaid as part of the settlement. The remaining amount was absorbed as a loss. Christine had told me early on to prepare for that, and I had. Some things cost what they cost. I drive to Fredericton now every other weekend, and I stay at a hotel on Regent Street, the kind with a pool that Cooper loves. And on Saturday mornings, I pick him up and we go to Odell Park and walk the trails and look for the red squirrels that live in the older oaks near the west entrance. Cooper calls them the fat ones, which is accurate, and I have not corrected him because that is exactly the right name for them, and I hope he keeps it forever. He is not yet 2, but he holds my hand going downstairs with great seriousness, like the job of keeping me steady is one he takes personally. If you're a parent or a grandparent watching this and recognizing something in what I've described, I want to say something directly. What happened in my family has a name. Isolation is rarely loud. It doesn't usually arrive as a confrontation. It arrives as a schedule, a policy, a request that sounds reasonable until it's followed by another request and then another, each one quietly narrowing the space you're allowed to occupy in someone else's life. I am not a lawyer and I'm not a financial advisor, but I can tell you 2 things I wish I had known earlier. The first is that grandparents in New Brunswick, as in most Canadian provinces, have the legal right to apply for access to grandchildren when that access is being unreasonably denied. The family court's primary concern is the best interest of the child, and courts in this province have historically taken a dim view of arrangements that cut children off from extended family without good reason. I did not know this before I spoke to Christine. I am telling you now. The second is that money given to family should be documented, not because you don't trust them, because documentation protects everyone, including the relationship. A short written note at the time of transfer, even just a text or email confirming the amount and the purpose, can matter enormously later. I didn't do that. I assumed trust made documentation unnecessary. I learned that is not always true. And if you can see someone you love being slowly closed off from their own family, being told the rules have changed again, being made to feel that access to their children is a privilege that must be earned, rather than a relationship that belongs to all of them, say something. Not in a way that creates a bigger fire. Just say something. Because the person inside that situation is usually too busy following the rules to see that the rules were never fair to begin with. Last month, Cooper said Grandpa Robert for the first time, with the emphasis on Robert like the second word was the important one, the one that meant something specific. I was sitting in the park and I had to take a breath before I could answer him. Carol would have been completely undone by that. She would have cried and then denied crying and then called everyone she knew. I drove home with the window down a little, even though it was October and cold, the way she always liked it, and I thought about her the whole way back, and somewhere around Salisbury, I was almost certain she already knew. There's something I've been sitting with since all of this settled, and it's this. The people who try to control access to the ones you love are rarely doing it out of nowhere. Marcus didn't wake up one morning and decide to be the kind of man who charges a grandfather $600 a month to hold his grandson. That kind of thing builds slowly, from a belief that relationships are resources to be managed, that love is leverage, that the people around you are pieces to be positioned rather than people to be known. I don't say that to excuse what he did. I say it because understanding it is the only way to protect yourself from it. What I did, what I had to learn to do, was stop confusing patience with passivity. I am a patient man. I spent 34 years teaching teenagers who didn't want to be in a classroom, and I learned that patience is a form of respect. But there is a difference between giving someone time to grow and absorbing harm while you wait. Marcus counted on the fact that I wouldn't push back. He had read me correctly as someone who avoids conflict, and for a long time that reading served him well. The $45,000 I gave without documentation, the visits I drove 4 hours for, and left without seeing anyone, the requests I accepted without questioning, all of it added up to a picture of a man who could be managed. He was not entirely wrong. I had been managed. What changed was not my temperament, it was my understanding. When Christine LeBeau explained my rights to me in plain language and Gerald Burke laid out the bank records on his desk, I was not suddenly angry. I was informed. And there is a particular kind of steadiness that comes from being informed, a quality that has nothing to do with winning and everything to do with seeing clearly. I acted from that place, not from hurt, not from the desire to punish Marcus, but from the simple conviction that Ellie deserved to know what had been done, and Cooper deserved to know his grandfather without a price attached to it. I think about the people who stay inside these situations for years, and I understand why they do. It is genuinely difficult to see manipulation from the inside, especially when the person doing it is skilled, and the people you love have normalized it. Ellie is not a passive person. She is her mother's daughter in most of the ways that matter. But she had been living inside Marcus's arrangements for long enough that she had started translating them as personality rather than pattern. That translation is what he depended on. What I hope, if you are sitting somewhere watching this and recognizing something, is that you trust the discomfort you feel. Not every uncomfortable situation is wrong, but the persistent, low-grade feeling that you are being managed, that the rules keep changing, that access to your own family is somehow conditional. That feeling is usually pointing at something real. You don't have to be loud about it. You don't have to be confrontational. But you do have to be honest with yourself, and then you have to do the quiet, careful, unglamorous work of finding out what you're actually dealing with. That work takes integrity. It takes clear thinking, and it takes the kind of resolve that doesn't make noise, just keeps moving. Carol would have seen Marcus for what he was in the first year. I got there eventually. That's enough.